Great, fantastic. So welcome everyone. So happy that you could join us this evening. My name is Anna Rubinovsky. I'm the Ada Booth librarian at Monash University. So I'm the subject librarian for Slavic Studies, and I'm responsible for all our Eastern European and Slavic collections. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of 3 Ada Booth Fellowship lectures. Before we start, I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands we are gathering today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to welcome Mark Palanche, Provost and Senior Vice President of Monash University, and Bob Garrity, our University Librarian. Also one of the Ada Booth trustees, so welcome. To tell you a little bit about our collection, the core of our Slavic and Eastern European collections is the Ada Booth Slavic collection. It was established in 2011 after the library received a large benefaction from the late Ada Phyllis Booth, who was a physicist and lecturer at the University of Melbourne. Ada was not a scholar of Slavic or Eastern European studies. She had no roots in Eastern Europe. But she had a lifelong interest in the Soviet Union and left-wing politics. So she was interested in communism for quite a while before she visited Russia and fell a little bit out of love with that idea of communism. But her generous gift to the university has allowed us to continue to build one of the most significant, and may I dare say, one of the best Slavic and Eastern European collections in the Southern Hemisphere. Of course, we're biased. And this year we have launched the Ada Booth Research Fellowship Program. Its aim is to promote the use of the library's Slavic collection and support and strengthen the Slavic studies community in Australia. Jeff is our inaugural Ada Booth Research Fellow, and he's one of 3 international researchers hosted by the library this year. So we have Marta Havriško and Simone Bellezza here as well, so they will do talks at the end of the month if you're interested. We have flyers in the back. Now, before I introduce Jeff to you, I would like to take the opportunity to thank a number of people who made all of this possible. So I would like to thank our former university librarians, Catherine Harbour-Ray, who laid the groundwork for the fellowship program, and Jeanette Burke, who saw it through its initiation. And of course, our current university librarian, Bob Garrity, who is overseeing the fruit of their hard work. Also, a special thanks as well to the other Ada Booth trustees who unfortunately couldn't be here, Jeanette Brooks and Louise Garrick. And I would also like to especially thank Marion Miller and Catherine O'Neill, who organized this event and helped a lot with the fellowship. Also to Kay Sullivan and Heidi Bingay, also Rosemary Miller, and all of our other library staff who helped us through all this. Now, before we start the talk, I would ask you, if you have your mobile phone with you, please put it on silent. And I would now like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Geoff Brown. Geoff is a historian from Canada who has also studied in the Czech Republic and New Zealand. His research interests are focused on the 20th century Czechoslovakia and Central Europe, particularly issues of national loyalty, ethnic minorities, and anti-communist resistance. His PhD thesis work looked at interwar Czechoslovakia's administration of its eastern territory of Carpathian Rus as part of the Czech colonial imagination. He has published on various aspects of Czechoslovak history, particularly on ethnic minority rights in the interwar First Republic. He is currently working on anti-communist activism among Czechoslovak exiles in North America and Western Europe, and now also here in Australia. Geoff will present the outcomes of his research project on Czechoslovak Anti-Communist Publications in Australia, with a focus on Czech publications. We will have time for questions after the lecture. I would also ask you to please stay here for a few minutes after the lecture. We would really like to take a group picture of you with Geoff together so we can commemorate this event. And I would now ask you to please make Geoff feel welcome for his talk.
Well, thank you to Anna, and of course thank you to Monash University Library, and thank you to everybody for coming today as well. I see a lot of familiar faces here in the crowd, which is nice. Okay, let's begin. 2018 is a significant year for historical anniversaries of Czechoslovakia. Earlier this week, there were celebrations to mark 100 years since the founding of the Czechoslovak state in 1918, and in August, 50 years had passed since the events of the Prague Spring and Warsaw Pact invasion in 1968. Seeing how these events were commemorated in Czech and Slovak diaspora communities, including here in Australia, led me to reflect on the difference between being an exile and being an immigrant during the communist period. Immigrants fled their country to start a new life in a new country, to establish themselves, learn a new language, assimilate into the society, and become citizens of their new country in passport and in mentality. Exiles, on the other hand, saw their time living abroad in the West as a waiting period until the day would finally come when they could return home again and would actively contribute towards achieving the goal of regime change, democracy, and human rights in their home country. The story I'm about to tell is about a small but determined group of exiles in Australia who tried to encourage the diaspora community to keep struggling for the cause of regime change in their country on the other side of the world, despite the easier path of assimilating into Australian society and becoming Australian. Owing to the geographical remoteness of Australia and the relatively small number of Czechoslovaks who settled here, the exile community operated on the periphery of the broader anti-communist movement among exiles in Western countries, taking a secondary role when compared to the larger exile communities then operating in Western Europe, Canada, and the United States. However, the influence Czechoslovak exiles in Australia had in fostering democratic change in their country should not be underestimated. They were well connected within the worldwide exile movement, and their activities had a visible impact within Czechoslovakia through the communist government's attempts to discredit them and through their contact with dissidents. The initial wave of Czechoslovaks which arrived in Australia following the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948 amounted to 12,000 to 13,000 people, and this group is widely known within the community as the 48ers. A significant proportion of those who had escaped from Czechoslovakia were well-educated professionals who came from cities, yet upon their arrival by ship in Australia, they were all given the document which stated their occupation as labourer, regardless if they had been doctors, lawyers, or journalists. Government regulations required them to complete a 2-year work placement in a location assigned to them, and this meant that a surgeon could be sent to work on a farm in Mildura, and former members of the Czechoslovak Parliament could be sent to clear the bush in Tasmania. The fact that their European qualifications were not recognized made life difficult for many of these new arrivals, and these comments by a doctor in Sydney in 1952 are typical. To speak sincerely, this is the reason why I'm leaving Australia for the USA. As a Czech doctor, I haven't got the slightest chance here. I don't intend to die as a general laborer in a factory, and such a problem with qualifications does not exist for us in the United States. Following the 2-year work placement, migrants could move where they wished, and most Czechoslovaks eventually settled in Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide, with smaller populations in Queensland, Tasmania, and Western Australia. Upon their arrival, many Czechoslovaks thought their time in Australia could last just a few years, merely a forced period of exile, which would last only until the communist government in Czechoslovakia could be overthrown, either internally or through external pressure coming from the West. Some actively sought to join the Australian armed forces in the hope that they could help in the future liberation of their country. But the military in Australia would not accept migrants coming from Iron Curtain countries in the early 1950s, seeing them as a particular security risk. Czechoslovaks also feared being placed in Australian detention camps as enemy combatants if war against the Soviet Union were to break out. Employment discrimination and distrust of new Australians as a source of crime added to some of the difficulties faced by 48ers during the first years in the country. Czechoslovaks were quick to begin organizing political and social organizations, and the first newspapers and journals written in Czech and Slovak appeared in the early 1950s. Hlas Domova, Voice of the Homeland, founded in Melbourne in 1950, would become by far the most important Czechoslovak publication in Australia, and its circle of writers would form the core of the Czechoslovak anti-communist movement within Australia. Founded by Josef Ripar and František Vanja, the newspaper developed from the idea of an exile newspaper that would be the equal of those in North America and Western Europe. Ripar died shortly before the newspaper began publishing, and Vanja became the editor, with the newspaper being published out of his home in Richmond. Karel Wendt and Václav Michal soon became other important members of the editorial staff as Hlas Domova grew in size and readership. Vanya worked as an assistant librarian at the University of Melbourne, never seeking to progress in his career because nearly all his time and energy would be devoted to the development and printing of his newspaper. As Karel Wendt would later put it, Hlas Domova was the heart of the Czechoslovak exile movement in Australia, and František Vanya was Hlas Domova. The first issues produced in 1950 were confiscated since foreign language newspapers needed a special permit from the Immigration Department in Australia. Undeterred, the group applied for a permit and continued producing underground copies of the paper as a chain letter to be passed from hand to hand. The first official issue of the newspaper finally appeared in July 1951. In the early 1950s, Australian law also required foreign language publications to include 25% English language content as a means of promoting the learning of English. Until this policy was abolished in 1954, Václav Mikl wrote most of the English content for the newspaper, as he was the only one fluent in English in the early years. Hlas Domova's first print runs were quite small, but by 1955 it had grown to 1,500 copies, and by the late 1960s there were up to 3,000 copies of each issue. For the first few years, the political news stories came from Vanya's friend in London, Josef Josten, who ran the Free Czechoslovakia Information Service. Links were slowly forged with dozens of other Czechoslovak exile newspapers operating in the West, and a system was put in place whereby Hlas Domova would send copies of their newspaper free of charge to these newspapers in return for a copy from the partner publication. Through this process, the Czechoslovaks in Australia were able to keep informed about all developments happening within the broader exile community. Articles also appeared in Hlas Domova by all the leading exiled journalists and writers, including Ferdinand Peroutka, Pavel Tigrid, Karel Schwarzenberg, and Josef Škvorecký. Ferdinand Peroutka, one of the leading Czech journalists of the 20th century, would later praise Hlas Domova as, quote, the best of all the Czechoslovak exile newspapers, despite its relatively small circulation numbers and influence compared to the main exile publications such as Pavel Tigrid's Svědectví. Hlas Domova also had an early rival for the Czechoslovak Australian audience in the 1950s. The newspaper Pacific, published in Auckland and Wellington and later in Sydney, reached readers in all parts of Australia and New Zealand, but its print run never exceeded 550 copies. Its editors František Bejček in Sydney and Zdeněk Kučera in Auckland combined more New Zealand news content with a more tabloid writing style, but the newspaper folded for financial reasons in 1960, unable to compete with Hlas Domova. A prominent Czechoslovak exile and anti-communist who did not at first write for Hlas Domova was Jindřich Nermut, a former Czechoslovak member of parliament who settled in Beaconsfield, Tasmania. Nermut became the head of the first Australia-wide anti-communist organization among Czechoslovaks, the Alliance of Czechoslovak Democratic Organizations in Australia and New Zealand. The organization wasn't only concerned with fighting communism in Czechoslovakia, since the Australian Communist Party of the early 1950s had a level of influence among labor unions which greatly alarmed the Czechoslovak community. They saw similar conditions for the spread of communism in Australia to those in their own country and feared another possible communist coup. In 1951, the Robert Menzies Liberal government was equally keen to ban the Communist Party of Australia, but lacking the legal clout to do so, they held a public referendum to gain the necessary backing. The Alliance of Czechoslovak Democracy Organizations took on the task of ensuring the Australian public was properly informed about the dangers of communism before this vote. Jindřich Nermut and other members wrote more than 50 articles for the Australian press before and after the referendum result. Writing in November 1951, Nermut encouraged Australians to, quote, fight communism and its supporters wherever you find them. Clear this Asiatic menace out of your fine country and make Australia strong. What happened in Czechoslovakia should be a sad example and a sufficient demonstration of the necessity of preventing the communists from increasing their power here in Australia. This referendum motion to ban the communists was eventually defeated by a very narrow margin. Hlas Domova also faced attacks by the Communist Party of Australia. The Guardian, the party's Melbourne paper, referred to Hlas Domova in 1952 as a, quote, pro-fascist Czechoslovak émigré magazine published in Australia for a readership which forms a pro-Nazi element among Czech migrants who ran from Czechoslovakia when it was in fact liberated from Nazi occupation. Hlas Domova's Václav Michal published a response to these comments. We did not escape because we were liberated by the Red Army. We escaped because a small minority of fanatics seized power in our country. The real reason why we publish our newspaper is to prevent this from potentially happening here. We learned in our own country that every newspaper was branded pro-fascist except for the communist newspapers. We are anti-communist and we consider it our duty to warn all of our Australian readers. Hlas Domova also attracted the attention of the communist press in Czechoslovakia. In 1954, Bratislava's Pravda called Hlas Domova a, quote, voice for those who have betrayed their country, while poverty, hunger, and growing moral decay among the emigres in Australia serves to increase the crime rate among them, from petty theft to murder. In September 1954, the Australian visit of Czechoslovak religious leader Dr. Hromadka led to angry and sometimes violent protests in each city that he visited. A founder of the Christian Peace Conference organization, Hromadka attracted anti-communist demonstrators who heckled him and prevented him from speaking to audiences. The Argus in Melbourne reported that, quote, hundreds of new Australians, apparently Czechs, shouting Hromadka out, turned the Peace Forum meeting into an uproar. About 100 new Australian demonstrators paraded outside the hall carrying banners with anti-communist slogans and distributing leaflets. Similar scenes to this occurred in Sydney, Brisbane, and Adelaide, with police making arrests and confiscating their leaflets. Writing to the editor of the Melbourne Herald, a Czech protester explained their position. Quote, between the two world wars, our country, Czechoslovakia, was just as free and democratic as Australia is now. I regard it as my duty to prevent Dr. Hromadka from exploiting freedom of speech in this country and spreading communist propaganda. I am aware that the reputation of Czechoslovaks in Australia may have suffered by these protest incidents, but I feel that no price is too high to help stop the growth of communism. Seeing this hostility of exile organizations abroad as a threat to the state, in 1955, the Czechoslovak government launched a campaign offering amnesty to all Czechoslovaks who wished to return again to live in their home country. František Vania wrote of the offer in Hlas Domova, warning readers not to be fooled. Quote, as long as Czechoslovakia is not free, our place is abroad. You know what communist promises are like. Do not believe them. As part of the amnesty campaign, the government of Czechoslovakia published a rival newspaper aimed at the exile communities, which was also called Hlas Domova. The publication was sent to emigres whose addresses had been identified by Czechoslovak officials. In an open letter to the president of the Committee for Returnees in Prague, the Melbourne Hlas Domova made a rather tongue-in-cheek offer to them. Quote, we realize that your Prague Hlas Domova will not reach all readers in Australia. We therefore offer you that in every issue of our Melbourne Hlas Domova, you can use one full page where you can write whatever you want to tell Czech migrants here in Australia. We have only one condition. We request that in return, once a fortnight, you give us one page of your Prague newspaper, Svobodné slovo, where we can write why we think we should not return to live in Czechoslovakia. Obviously, they didn't get an answer to that. A further cause for protest in 1954 was the famous Petrov affair, when a Soviet diplomat in Canberra agreed to defect and his wife Evdokia was forced to board a plane in Sydney to return to Moscow. Mobilized by Sydney leader Tomáš Jílek, hundreds of Czechoslovaks turned out at the airport and, as reported here in Pacific, shouted their demands for a free Czechoslovakia in a free Europe. At the time, it was the largest public demonstration by Czechoslovaks in Australia, and due to the international press coverage of the Petrov affair, it brought greater attention to their cause. The Czechoslovak community also forged ties with other national exile communities within Australia. Joint meetings were held in Melbourne and in Sydney with Polish pro-democracy organizations, and the Hungarian uprising of 1956 led Czechoslovaks to show their support for the local Hungarian community. Hlas Domova printed an anti-communist leaflet about the events in Budapest and encouraged their readers to spread copies of the leaflet among their Australian friends. The Melbourne Olympics of 1956 was another very significant event as the Czechoslovak community debated whether or not to welcome the athletes coming from Czechoslovakia. In the end, a compromise of supporting the athletes but shunning the Olympic and government officials who accompanied them took shape. Václav Mikl described the arrival of the athletes in Hlas Domova. Quote, "The staff of the Czechoslovak consulate stand in a corner. The arrival of the Czechoslovak Olympians was probably planned differently. Under the current conditions in Essendon Airport, they aren't able to escort the team to the cars. The athletes are meeting with people in the crowd, they're signing autographs, answering questions, thanking the well-wishers who hope for their success. The Iron Curtain has fallen here at Essendon Airport. Inside, there are only consulate employees and Olympic officials. Outside, they are the Czechoslovaks." A secret initiative at the Olympics was also planned to help Czechoslovak athletes try to defect while they were in Melbourne. This letter from Sydney activist Mojmír Zakar to František Vanya and Josef Jostin details several different possible plans, including using fake British and American journalist IDs to enter the Olympic Village and try to make contact with the athletes to arrange an escape attempt. No athlete successfully defected in the end, although the Czechoslovak delegation may have suspected something as the athletes left Melbourne by ship several days earlier than had been originally planned. In 1960, Brisbane activist Stanislav Pokorny convinced František Vanya and the Hlas Domova Writers' Circle to create a newspaper specifically designed to be smuggled into Czechoslovakia to inform people there about life in the world beyond the Iron Curtain. Called Kořeny, Roots, only 2 issues of this paper were produced before the financial cost involved became too excessive. After they were published in Melbourne, Vanya sent copies of the newspaper to a contact in Norway, Anna Kvapilova, who posted the newspaper to different locations in Czechoslovakia, using random days and different post boxes in Norway, so there would be no consistent order in how they were sent. The address printed on the copies of Kořeny was for a post box in Hamburg, Germany, paid for by Josef Kinda from Melbourne, a further distractor to make it hard for Czechoslovak authorities to track down the real source of this newspaper. By the early 1960s, nearly 95% of Czechoslovaks had taken Australian citizenship, which increased their national loyalty to Australia and their interest in Australian politics. The formation of the Democratic Labour Party in 1955, following the split in the Australian Labour Party, had given them a clear anti-communist party to vote for, and B.A. Santa Maria and the party's Catholic supporters reached out to migrants from Iron Curtain countries as some of their most dedicated voters. In 1961, the DLP party first ran campaign advertising in Hlas Domova in the Czech language. The poster depicts the different parties only in terms of their connections to the communists. The Labour Party cooperate with communists, the Liberal Party don't actively oppose communists, therefore the Democratic Labour Party is the only party which truly fights communism in Australia. Jindřich Nermut from Tasmania would later become a candidate for the DLP party, running unsuccessfully for the House of Representatives and the Senate in the 1970s. Between 1959 and 1964, a series of events occurred which caused a political rift within the Czechoslovak community in Australia. In August 1959, the University of Adelaide organized an international music festival and invited members of the local Czechoslovak club to perform folk dances. Shortly before the start of this festival, the Czechoslovak club learned that dancers and musicians traveling from Czechoslovakia were also going to participate. Members of the Adelaide community felt that they should not perform together with anyone from Czechoslovakia, but concerned that their refusal would be considered an insult to the University of Adelaide, the club went ahead and performed with the visiting Czechoslovak artists. A backlash immediately occurred against those who had taken part, and the Adelaide community was bitterly divided. Similar events happened again in Adelaide at another festival 3 years later. In 1964, the Prague Black Theatre group of artists toured Australia, attracting similar boycotts from parts of the Czechoslovak community who refused to have anything to do with visiting communists. I'm not actually sure why there's a Q in the spelling of Prague here. From this series of events, the exile anti-communist movement in Australia split into different opposing factions. The hard-line anti-communists maintained a rigid refusal against interacting, helping, or doing any business with the communists, while the more gradualist anti-communists aimed to support communist reforms in Czechoslovakia to bring about a slow evolution towards democracy. This reflected locally a broader trend than occurring in Czechoslovak exile politics worldwide. The Council of Free Czechoslovakia in Washington, the most important exile organization, was similarly divided between delegates who favored a hard-line approach and those who supported the more gradualist approach, causing it to split in two in the early 1960s. Seeking to heal the ideological divide between the exiles based in Australia, in 1964, the Alliance of Czechoslovak Democratic Associations developed a third possible option, which occupied the middle ground between the two opposing factions. Promoted as positive anti-communism, the movement aimed to forge common agreement between the rival groups and bring peace to the exile movement. A leaflet published in English by the association explained their position. It is possible to observe two groups in our exile which wrongly evaluate the situation and reach mistaken conclusions. One group thinks that it is sufficient to broadcast to the world reports of the horror of communism and to proclaim to the subjugated nations how ideal and beautiful the West is, and to wait with folded arms for the solution to resolve itself, either by war or by a revolution in the oppressed lands. The other extreme group wants to influence the evolution behind the Iron Curtain by supporting revisionist efforts in the nations, and goes so far as to openly incite Czechoslovak workers not to turn their backs on the Communist Party, but to actually make their demands through the party. The positive anti-communist movement was supported by many in the Australian community. However, the three streams of anti-communist ideology continued to compete against each other, with hardliners, positivists, and gradualists all seeking to promote their own method for dealing with the communists. In the 1960s, a prominent Czech hardline anti-communist appeared in Australia in the form of František, generally known as Frank Knopfelmacher, a close associate of Santa Maria and the Catholic movement within the Democratic Labour Party. A Czech Jew who had grown up in Vienna, Knopfelmacher was seen as a very polarizing figure in the Czechoslovak community and in Australian society more generally, due to his uncompromising stance towards communists and his outspoken and sometimes very erratic public behavior. As a lecturer in psychology at the University of Melbourne, he pursued an anti-communist agenda against a university establishment which was very sympathetic to the communist cause, as was the case at most Australian universities in that time period. While his scholarly abilities were well regarded, he was shunned by most of the faculty as an extremist. In 1965, he applied to become a lecturer at the University of Sydney and was rejected despite being the most qualified applicant for this post. Knopfelmacher and his supporters considered the university's rejection to be politically motivated due to his confrontational behavior towards socialist academics, and widespread media coverage of this event helped him to become a leading figure among Australia's strongest anti-communists. Although Knopfelmacher and the Hlastomova Writers' Circle continued their public fight against communism through the 1960s, across the broader Czechoslovak community in Australia, exile activism began to fade, and interest in Czechoslovak clubs and organizations also began to slowly weaken. After 15 years living in Australia and a high number of intermarriages with other ethnic groups, some in the community had begun to feel more Australian than Czech or Slovak. Most 48ers had given up hope that they would ever be able to return to live in a democratic Czechoslovakia again. This chart shows the community engagement of East European ethnic groups in Adelaide. The percentage of Czechs and Slovaks involved in ethnic community organizations had by this time dropped to less than half. Some public demonstrations by Czechoslovak exiles did occur in the 1960s, such as this description of a protest outside the Czechoslovak consulate in Sydney. Quote, "After many years of meetings and protests only on paper, a political event was organized in Sydney to alert the Australian public to the dangers of communism and publicly show our disapproval of the current regime in Czechoslovakia. And, the author concluded, to prove that the exile spirit is still alive." Stanislav Pokorny wrote about the protest in Hlas Domova and claimed that, quote, "We must wake our fellow exiles from their slumber." But things began to happen in Czechoslovakia in 1967, which restored the faith of the exile activists that there was reason for optimism. The election of Alexander Dubček as first secretary of the Communist Party in January 1968 ushered in a process of reforms known as the Prague Spring, which partly restored freedom of the press and free speech and relaxed rules for citizens traveling to the West. Restrictions on Czechoslovaks in exile traveling to Czechoslovakia were also partially lifted, arousing interest in Czechoslovakia about the possibility of visiting home for the first time in many years, and some actually made the journey. Václav Michal wrote in Hlas Domova that the reforms being undertaken in Czechoslovakia had, quote, "after almost 20 years, given us reason to hope that the existence and continued actions of Czechoslovak exiles has been justified." Karel Wendt also wrote in March 1968 asking, quote, "What is the role of the exile press? The answer is to be ready when the time comes, and that time is now." Some further evidence of Hlas Domova's expanding international influence came during the Prague Spring. Dissident playwright Václav Havel wrote to Hlas Domova praising the quality of the journalism in their Australian newspaper, telling them that Pavel Tigrid had shown him copies while he was in Paris. Havel also asked the Hlas Domova writers under what circumstances they would be willing to return to live in Czechoslovakia if the political thaw were to continue. However, the unbridled optimism of Czechoslovak exiles came to a crashing halt on the 21st of August 1968 with the invasion of Warsaw Pact tanks into Czechoslovakia and directives coming from Moscow which put an immediate end to Alexander Dubček's pro-democracy reforms. In the first issue of Hlas Domova after the invasion, Karel Wendt wrote that the event must re-galvanize the exile protest movement and force the community in Australia to think about their countrymen. Quote, "Our resistance not only must continue, it must be sharpened, it must be active. The time has come that we start to like again and that we start to hate again. The time has come that we become exiles again and that we act like exiles." The Czechoslovak community organized public protests against the invasion in all major cities in Australia, from Hobart to Darwin. The largest event took place in Melbourne, with a protest held at the Olympic Swimming Stadium. Frank Knopfelmacher addressed the crowd and asked attending Liberal Party MPs to break off diplomatic relations with countries which had sent troops into Czechoslovakia. In Sydney, more than 1,000 Czechoslovaks demonstrated in Martin Place, while in Canberra, protests occurred outside the embassy of the Soviet Union, with members of the community continuing a silent protest outside the embassy for several weeks. The events in Czechoslovakia also brought a new wave of political refugees to Australia, with more than 7,000 arriving between August 1968 and August 1970, all of them knowing that their move to Australia was probably permanent. The new arrivals were an injection of lifeblood into the local community, and the 48ers were quick to arrange help for the newly arrived 68ers with government paperwork, offering their houses as temporary accommodation, and helping them to find employment. For example, the family of František Vanya had new refugee arrivals sleeping on the sofas, chairs, and floor of their house for months at a time in 1968 and 1969. The The Hlastomova writers also organized a Czechoslovak aid fund to collect donations to help Czechoslovaks who had recently arrived in Czechoslovakia and those still in refugee camps in Western Europe. And copies of Hlastomova were sent to refugees in Western Europe and Yugoslavia to encourage them to choose to come to Australia. Refugees who had recently arrived in Australia were also given free copies of Hlastomova for the first 3 months after their arrival. The new wave of 68ers arriving in Australia also brought a new crop of hardened anti-communist writers to work for Hlastomova. One of the most important of these was Marcela Čechová, who arrived in Melbourne a month after the Warsaw Pact invasion and began writing for Hlastomova just a few weeks later in October 1968. Čechová had written for the newspaper Mladá Fronta in Czechoslovakia, and with her first-hand knowledge of life under communism, she worked hard to show the Czechoslovak 48ers in Australia what conditions were really like in their country. She also pulled no punches, frequently getting into angry debates in the letters to the editor section with her readers, almost always men, who often found her opinions far too blunt and outspoken. She wrote frequently about women's rights and social justice issues in Czechoslovakia, and I see her as quite a strong feminist writer of the 60s and 70s who always stood her ground when challenged. Angered by the common exile practice of sending money to relatives in Czechoslovakia so they could buy products in the foreign currency shops called tuzeks, a process which helped the communist government take in foreign cash reserves, Čechová told her readers that, quote, Tuzeks coupons are not what the nation needs to receive from the exiles. The nation needs moral support, freedom of information, a belief in change for the better. If I could smuggle just one copy of Ferdinand Perelka's Democratic Manifesto into Czechoslovakia, it would be far more valuable than if I sent them enough Tuzeks money to buy them all cars. The death of Jan Palach by self-immolation in Prague in 1969 made him a martyr to the cause of freedom in Czechoslovakia, and the date of his death, the 19th of January, joined other days of protest in the exile calendar, together with the 25th of February, the anniversary of the communist coup in 1948, and the 21st of August, the day of the Warsaw Pact invasion in 1968. A regular series of anti-communist cartoons appeared in Hlastomova between 1969 and 1971, usually with a sarcastic message about life under communism in Czechoslovakia. Here we see two Czechoslovaks discussing Jan Palach's influence on the second anniversary of his death. We managed to extinguish the flames after 2 years, comrade, but somehow the glow is still there. These cartoons were created by Aleš Nebeský, a trained graphic artist who joined Hlastomova after his arrival in Australia in 1968. The images depicted Czechoslovak citizens passively accepting the return of repression in their country. A man thanks the Russian tank driver for running him over. A journalist gagged by party censorship agrees that it's all for the best. This Christmas cartoon called on the Australian exiles to keep remembering the suffering of those at home on the other side of the world. Such reminders were necessary as the huge crowds of protesters who had come out in 1968 at the time of the invasion grew smaller and smaller each year on the August anniversary. In 1969, on the first anniversary of the invasion, exile organizers in Melbourne called on Czechs and Slovaks to commemorate the martyr for freedom, Jan Palach, and other victims of Soviet despotism in Czechoslovakia, in a demonstration which was held at Melbourne Town Hall. The following year on the anniversary, the promotional flyer reads, "They can't protest at home, you can. Alert the public about the occupation of Czechoslovakia." But it also adds, "Prove that you haven't forgotten." A cartoon by Aleš Nebeský also tried to bring attention to the declining interest in public protest, with a cartoon showing the decreasing numbers since 1968 and suggesting that there was no one left who could be bothered to turn out in 1970. There was an improved turnout in 1971 due to increased publicity and planning for the demonstrations. A parade took place through the central streets of Melbourne with 96 cars decorated with Czechoslovak flags taking part. Some in Sydney took their enthusiasm for protest even a little further that year. A homemade bomb was thrown into the courtyard of the Czechoslovak consulate on the morning of the anniversary. It didn't explode, and police never found who was responsible. However, 1971 was the final year when exile organizers could motivate significant numbers of Czechoslovaks in Australia to come into the streets to demonstrate against the occupation in their country. In 1972, Karel Vent chastised the community for the lack of commitment to the cause of freedom. Quote, "The first task of a political exile is to prove to the world around them that the Czechoslovak problem still persists. Czechoslovak exile organizations in Australia held these events on the 4th anniversary of the Soviet attack." Zero. Note the very clear indication of the zero here. Although direct forms of public activism were fading, the 1970s was a time of new interest in supporting exile literature. 68 publishers in Toronto, Canada began publishing the works of leading exile authors such as Josef Skvorecký, while CCC Publishers in Munich became the main Czechoslovak exile publisher within Europe. Hlas Domova became the official distributor for 68 publishers in Australia, while Marcela Čechová became the distributor for CCC Publishers from her home in Melbourne. In this period, the main focus of exile anger also shifted from the Czechoslovak government to the Soviet Union as occupiers oppressing the intentions of Czechoslovaks, and as a result, collaboration with other national communities in exile increased in organizations such as the Council of Captive Nations. The election of the Whitlam Labour government in 1972 brought new concerns among the exiles of creeping communist influence within Australia. During the 1972 campaign, the Committee of Czechoslovak Democratic Organizations distributed leaflets warning of the dangers of a Labour government. At that time, a majority of Czechoslovak voters gave their first vote to the DLP and their second vote to the Liberal Party in a coordinated blocking move by the DLP to prevent the Labour Party from being able to take power. However, the DLP had all but folded by 1975, and the Liberal Party began courting anti-communist voters from Iron Curtain countries, depicting Labour as soft on communism. In this Liberal Party ad for the 1975 campaign, the party called on Czechoslovaks to remember the events in Czechoslovakia, help to prevent it from happening here in Australia. In response to the Whitlam government and the more socialist direction it took Australia from 1972 to 1975, Czechoslovak exile organizations returned to their role of warning the Australian public about communism. This pamphlet was distributed in Melbourne and Sydney in 1976 by the Committee of Czechoslovak Democratic Organizations in Australia. The committee also ran a campaign in 1975 and 76 in coordination with Catholic Church leaders to keep communist propaganda publications out of Australian schools. The signing of Charter 77 by dissidents in Czechoslovakia at the beginning of 1977 rejuvenated the hopes of exiles that democratic change was still possible after years of pessimism. Hlas Domova published the full text in January 1977, and it immediately sparked discussions in the Australian community about its meaning, who had signed it, and why. An exile movement in New York called Petition 78 aimed to gather signatures from Czechoslovaks abroad who wished to show their support for the Charter 77 dissidents, and many Australian exiles signed this petition. Following the arrest in 1979 of most of the Chartists in Czechoslovakia who had signed Charter 77, including Václav Havel, Karel Vent began a campaign in the Australian press to bolster public support for the Chartists. In November 1979, he wrote, quote, "It is important to know that the Chartists are not beyond help, that every citizen of the free world, which includes this still lucky country, can help. The dissidents, such as the dramatist Havel in Prague, keep stressing again and again the importance they attach to Western protests, which they regard as their only protection. All freedom-loving Australians can help the Czechoslovak defenders of human rights by expressing their anger to the Czechoslovak Consulate General in Sydney or by urging their own government to voice its indignation. In 1979, František Vanja declared that he would need to stop publishing Hlas domova due to health concerns, and the community began looking for a new editor willing to run their exile newspaper. This appeared in the form of Petr Rada, who had arrived in Melbourne in 1979. Rada was known in Czechoslovakia for his success as a songwriter, particularly for writing the main protest anthem of the Prague Spring, Modlitba pro Martu, Prayer for Martha. Rada agreed to become the editor of a new newspaper called Hlasy, Voices, which started publishing in 1980. The paper had new publishers and editors and lost some of Hlas domova's political exile spirit, but many of the anti-communist writers from Hlas domova continued to also write for Hlasy, notably Marcela Čechová, Stanislav Hoferek, Miloš Ondrašek, and Tasmanian Jindřich Nermut. Petr Rada also contributed articles to the newspaper in support of the Charter 77 dissidents, and this example from 1980 reflects the influence of Václav Havel's essays. Quote, "In a street in Prague, there are two shops. One is a butcher's and the other is a bookshop. In front of both, people stand in a queue, for pork shops and for detective novels. For the past 12 years, no one has dared to shake their fist in front of an armored tank. A man gets hungry for food and for books. He stands in a queue, waiting patiently until it's his turn, and until he has learned the lesson that in return for being obedient, he will receive meat and books, and his children will be allowed to go to school. 15 million people in Czechoslovakia have learned to show an obedient smile. 12 years ago, tanks from Russia arrived in front of our homes, but the path for them was prepared by our reluctance to look after our own affairs, our willingness to stand in a queue for pork and books." Concerned by the prison sentences given to many of the Charter 77 dissidents in Czechoslovakia and the impact this had on their families, Eva Greg from Melbourne started a public campaign in support of the dissidents, calling on the Australian public to send protest letters to Czechoslovak President Gustav Husak. She also launched the Charter 77 Fund, a means of collecting donations in Australia from the Czechoslovak community and the general public, which would help support the dissidents and their families. Hlas domova staff members František Vanja, Aleš Nebeský, and Karel Wendt also took part in organizing and promoting this Charter 77 Fund campaign, and Petr Rada publicized the call for donations in all issues of Hlasy. In the 1980s, the plays of Václav Havel were performed in Melbourne and Sydney for English-speaking audiences, and important figures in the exile movement visited Australia. Josef Josten met with exiles across Australia in 1980, including Vanja and the Hlas domova Circle in Melbourne, while Josef Skvorecký came in 1985. A new exile magazine appeared in 1986 in Melbourne as a potential rival to Hlasy. Panorama's editor Jiří Hodač claimed in the first issue that it, quote, wanted to build upon the very strong traditions established by Hlas domova. Numerous significant anti-communist writers published in Panorama, including Stanislav Hoferek and Aleš Nebeský, but the magazine lasted only until 1988, unable to find a large enough audience to support its publication. Exile activism in the Czechoslovak community had again sunk to a very low level by the mid-1980s, as the 68ers had all taken Australian citizenship, and most had accepted that real change in Czechoslovakia was unlikely. Assimilation into Australian society was relatively easy for Czechoslovaks, and their children had grown up as Australians who had little connection to their parents' homeland. The increased focus on life in Australia was reflected in the growing number of articles in Hlasy and Panorama about politics and current affairs in Australia, rather than focusing on events in Czechoslovakia, which was the traditional role of exile newspapers. In August 1988, on the 20th anniversary of the arrival of the 68ers in Australia and 48 years for the 48ers, Marcela Čechová asked Hlasy readers to complete a survey to determine the extent of their national loyalty to either Czechoslovakia or to Australia. Nearly all respondents at that time reported feeling more closely connected to Australia than to Czechoslovakia, often because their children only knew Australia, and that in the event of democracy being restored in Czechoslovakia, they would not be willing to return to live there because Australia had become their home. The events of November and December 1989, as the communist regime was swept away in Czechoslovakia, were greeted with a kind of subdued relief by most Czechoslovaks in Australia. Since the community was experiencing the events live on their television screens, printed political commentary in Hlasy and other publications seemed to have much less impact than it had in Hlas Domova during the events of 1968. Of course, the exile activists who had dedicated years of effort to bringing about regime change could look on at these events in quiet satisfaction. A few Czechoslovaks flew from Australia to Prague to experience the events for themselves in late 1989 and early 1990, but for most, it was a time for family gatherings rather than public expressions of emotion. Recognition of Hlas Domova as an important exile newspaper grew in the Czech Republic through the 1990s, and František Vania was eventually honored for his exile activities with a Czech State Medal of Honor awarded by President Václav Havel in 1997, 3 years after Vania's death in 1994. Vania also received recognition here in Australia for his pro-democracy publishing work, receiving the Order of the British Empire in 1975 and the Order of Australia in 1988. So, to conclude, ultimately, the influence of Australian Czechoslovaks in bringing about democratic change in Czechoslovakia was small compared to their compatriots in the USA, Canada, and Western Europe. Particularly, I think, after 1968, the Australian exile community became somewhat less significant within the diaspora because they did not develop any influential exile works of literature or their own exile publishing house. I think this can be largely attributed to the small size of the community. However, I believe that the activities and publications of these Australian exiles should not be seen as insignificant. They warned Australians of the dangers of communism and kept the issue of human rights in Czechoslovakia in the public eye. In particular, Hlas Domova was the equal of any exile newspaper in the West in terms of the quality of its journalism, and it gave the community a voice that could be heard on the world stage, including by the Czechoslovak government. Its writers remained determined and active exiles, in some cases even after 40 years living in Australia, and held on to their belief that it was worth striking a small blow at the communist regime in order to help the greater cause of returning democracy to their country. I'll finish there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So we will have some time for questions now, if you just want to raise your hand. No one? Even comments, Paula.
Thank you so much for just a really fascinating talk about something I've never heard anybody speak about, so kudos for breaking new ground. My question is about the relationship between the exile community and the government. So, you know, coming from the US perspective, where the government is like very active in doing anti-communist things, you know, Radio Free Europe or whatever, does the Australian government have any like active policy toward Czechoslovakia, and is there any engagement with the community here in shaping or enacting that policy?
Well, we have many people here from the community, I think, who can help me answer this question somewhat. Oh, sorry. Certainly the Australian government did have a policy towards Czechoslovakia, but in many cases it was not that different from their policy towards the broader East European bloc at that time. And at the same time, the Czechoslovak community were relatively small here compared to some of the other East European immigrant groups. So for example, like the Polish community were considerably larger here and had a lot more influence, like influence in government and more generally in society, I believe. But did they have no impact in government? Well, no, I wouldn't say that either. I would just say that it's relatively small. So, if any of the Czechoslovaks here want to speak, please add your comments.
I would like to comment on that, just saying that mainly it would only have come out during the pre-election time as part of the campaign.
During those times when the ads would appear in the Czech language, but there was very
that sort
little
of thing.
engagement at other
Otherwise,
times.
in between, very little, but particularly at election time to try to paint the Labor Party as strongly connected with Reds under the beds and so on.
I would say that I wrote a lot to Parliament for protest writing, and there were some politicians who always would agree and write to Czech government. There were writers like Patrick White who also agreed. The problem was with churches, because World Council of Churches and Christian Peace Conference were very pro-Russian. And I had a lot of problems with clergy trying to talk to them who were involved in this, because there was a lot of there were a lot of perks involved, you know, trips and lovely accommodation. And I think some writers like Frank Hardy and, you know, was similar. Actually, there's a Czech book by Paul, can't remember now. He was an academic here, and also he in America, he was Czech speaking, and he went to archives, and he wrote about some people, like from Melbourne University, I knew, who were terribly upset about the invasion of Czech Republic, but like Steve Murray Smith and, you know, guy who edited Me Engines, I think they were more than just sort of naive, you know, communists in 50s. I think there were a lot of perks. And I think unions, similar. And yeah, you mentioned Hromadka, Christian Peace Conference. Bishop Tos came here, Hungarian bishop who was the president. And I had few words with Uniting Church minister who was not only accompanying him, but he worked for Christian Peace Conference. And I was in touch with dissidents who suffered. And I had a letter one of the dissidents wrote to Bishop Toth and to World Council of Churches, how they ignored and actually harmed them. And when they come, that they're happy to have just official, you know, all the perks, but they never visited these persecuted. They didn't want to know them.
Well, there was certainly a whole range of visitors who came through the 50s that were met with angry protests all the time as soon as they arrived. I've chosen the Hromadka one as a good example of that situation, because I think it was one of the biggest and most meaningful at that time.
Well, Hromadka set up Christian Peace Conference. He really believed in Lenin. He was evangelical, Czech evangelical church. And
well, he had spent a lot of time living outside Czechoslovakia.
Well, look, at the time when he came to Australia, Bishop Toth from Catholic Church got 25 years prison for, you know, because Vatican was the second government, so Catholics were persecuted because of that. And he knew that there were people in concentration camp, but, you know, I mean, who could travel in those times when people were executed in camps, churches were persecuted? He thought that would be a way of surviving with communists, dialogue, he called it. But of course it worked out for the Communist Party because he had to obey. So when he came here, you know, he was seen in that light.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Any other questions, comments? Simone?
As I'm here studying the Ukrainian diaspora, I would like to ask whether there were some episode of collaborations with other groups, national groups of Eastern Europe. I was thinking, for example, of the bloc of anti-communist nations of Yaroslav Stetsko or something like that.
Certainly on a local level in Melbourne and in Sydney, yes, I'm aware that there were like a lot of links going on, maybe not so much with the Ukrainian community, but certainly more with the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Baltic countries in particular. I believe I have seen in Hlastomova at least 2 or 3 times the Ukrainian community mentioned as taking part in some kind of common meetings together with Czechoslovak organizations, but I think in general I would say those links are less. Like certainly the Poles were the biggest group that they collaborated with, followed by the Hungarians.
There were just few people doing it. It wasn't some mess, you know, but I remember I was at Melbourne University and I had a little stand in support of the Chartists, and Jewish people came and they were sort of talking more about Paul and how they were persecuted by church. And although they sympathize, there is more involvement with this background. So like Balts and Poles have very bad reputation, and Ukrainians, unfortunately, with Jewish people. So you had to persuade these people that it wasn't what they sort of thought.
All right, if there are no other questions, please join me in thanking Jeff. And we still want to do the group picture, so I guess if you could all come together at the front, in front of the PowerPoint. Thank you.